It's rare to have a game that mixes arcade gameplay with political satire. Incredibly rare, perhaps, especially from the arcade's golden age. But I feel a great need to cover what may just be the one arcade game that not only does both of these things, but does both of these things pretty well. Now, when you consider that the almighty Sega released over 150 arcade games in the 1980s alone, it's not exactly a surprise to find that a few of them may be a little strange. But there's not much at all out there like Gombi's I'm Sorry, the 1985 arcade game that sees you play as a politician, running around in a maze in search of gold bars, trying to avoid various celebrities who wish to punish you, and in particular, a large barrel that seems hell-bent on chasing you to the ends of the earth and flattening you under the weight of its porcine contents. I have mentioned this game a couple of times in the past, but it's definitely one that deserves a video all on its own. Because right from the outset, well, even if you didn't know anything about the game's context, it's clearly an odd title. You may think that this guy's just a salaryman, and there are people in sunglasses who are trying to catch him, and when they do, they'll suddenly put on S&M outfits and give this poor-suited sod a good spanking. And when you do know the context behind I'm Sorry, well, it turns out the game is so much more weird than that. Before we even look at the game properly, we have to take a little look at the person that the game is satirising, a famous or perhaps infamous and highly influential figure in Japanese politics, Kakuei Tanaka, a man from rural Niigata who came up from very little to become Japan's Prime Minister in 1972, only for his term to become embroiled in a corruption scandal that would see him resign in 1974, get even worse over the rest of the 70s, and would ultimately see him sentenced to 4 years in prison, although he didn't actually end up spending any time inside. His political career started in the 1940s. He was part of what was eventually known as the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, a conservative party as it goes. And well, he was in many ways the classic conservative politician, all about the free enterprise, all about the populism, the straight talking, the traditional values, and so on and so forth. Really, there's quite a lot of parallels to Richard Nixon here. Although Tanaka perhaps didn't have quite so many demons as Nixon, and certainly wasn't as aloof. One of those politicians who had a knack for remembering everyone's name, highly gracious and helpful even to his biggest opponents if they ever had a personal issue, and so on. There's the silly little signature quirks too, always waving a fan around, particularly when speaking in public, and a simple yet memorable two-word catchphrase, "Hi hi," or "Yes yes." A big part of Tanaka's rise to power involved what's known as pork barrel politics. That's worth briefly going into, seeing as it's actually going to be a mechanic in the game we're covering. In case you didn't know, pork barrel politics is an American term from the 19th century that refers to the allocation of government spending to local projects, usually solely so that the representative in question gains from it. Apparently it has its origins in the practice of slaveholders rewarding their slaves with a barrel of salt pork, which they would then have to share out amongst themselves, usually by competing against each other. Anyway, Tanaka did a lot of this in order to consolidate his power base in Niigata, creating a group called the Etsuzankai that was, at one point, almost 100,000 members strong and was focused on these pork barrel projects. The King of Pork was one of Tanaka's many nicknames, and as his power in the LDP and in the cabinet increased, his election to PM was a virtual certainty. He reached the top in 1971 by a landslide, hugely popular with the public. Anywho, comparisons with Nixon intensify when you look at the man's foreign exploits as Prime Minister, which naturally include meeting with Tricky Dicky himself, seeing as they were contemporaries, and taking a hard line on trade between Japan and the States, as well as meeting Chairman Mao and seeking to normalise relations with China. Again, just like Nixon. And also like Nixon, it all falls apart in scandal and corruption. Initially, an investigation of deals that business people close to Tanaka had made for seemingly meaningless and obscure bits of land that strangely always preempted the announcement of a nearby project revealed that back in the 1960s Tanaka had made land deals using the name of a former geisha, Aki Sato, who he was in a long-term relationship with. Faced with the inevitability of Sato being called to the stand by the Diet, Tanaka made the decision to instead resign as PM in November of 1974. But that was far from the end of it. The really big corruption scandal was revealed by Lockheed in 1976 that Tanaka had personally accepted $1.8 million in bribes for a trading company in order to secure a deal for 21 Lockheed L-1011s in 1972 while he was Prime Minister. Not to go into too much detail, but this trial would run on and on for 7 years until Tanaka was finally found guilty in 1983. He was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment and fined 500 million yen, but naturally he appealed and had more than enough bail money on hand to keep himself out of doing porridge. This whole scandal and conviction, by the way, didn't exactly result in the end of his political career. He was still a part of the Diet, was re-elected to his Niigata seat in late 1983 by a huge margin, and he was still a very powerful figure in his party, with many supporters who believed the whole thing was a fix-up, quite possibly engineered by the states. He was most certainly still powerful enough to be a kingmaker in the LDP. At this stage he'd earned another sobriquet in the press, that of Dark Shogun, still pulling all the strings behind the scene. His power only truly started to wane in early 1985 after he suffered a stroke, but he still held influence. Despite the stroke, the sentence, and the loss of his appeal, he continued to retain his seat, and the Tanaka faction was still powerful enough to ensure the election of Nobuo Takeshita to the premiership in 1987. Another conservative politician whose reign would end up halted by scandal, but that's outside this video's purview. As for Tanaka himself, he retired from the Diet in 1989 and passed away in 1993 at the age of 75, a majorly influential and quite well supported figure right to the end. And with such a profile, such a character and such a, well, coloured history, he is obviously pretty ripe for lampooning. Anyway, Gombe's I'm Sorry was published by Sega in 1985, but actually developed by a company called Corland, who made games for a few companies including Konami and Data East, before eventually partnering with Bandai and becoming Banpresto. Their most successful game as Corland would unquestionably be 1982's Pengo. Gombe I'm Sorry is a wholly different beast of a game, although it is seen from a pretty familiar hymn sheet. It's a single-screen top-down maze game after all, so there is a pretty clear Pac-Man influence going on, just as you'd find in a whole load of other arcades from this era. The character that you play as isn't actually Tanaka himself, but a very blatant caricature of him called Gombe, and the title itself is something of a play on words. Sorry sounds similar to Sori, which is the Japanese word for Prime Minister. The goal of each level is pretty simple. You need to pick up the gold bars that are strewn around and take them back to the lavish looking building at the top, which does look somewhat similar to the National Diet building. Whenever you deposit the gold bars there, Gombe will dance around with his fans and shout, "Yeah, yeah!" in a crude take on Tanaka's aforementioned catchphrase, and in a similar vein to Flicky, you earn more points the more gold bars you take there at a time. In later levels, the bars won't all be immediately visible, they'll be inside safes which you have to break, and you do that by repeatedly punching them. The funniest part of the game, really, involves the set of enemies that you're up against. Your main adversary is a barrel that is constantly rolling around the stage, occasionally in pursuit of you, and while you're able to jump over the barrel, you cannot punch it, it is unbreakable. And of course, this barrel is not without meaning. It's most certainly there to signify Tanaka's aforementioned penchant for pork barrel politics, always moving and eager to flatten our beleaguered leader, in a rather unsubtle example of a man being hoisted up by his own petard. This is admittedly about as witty and as barbed as the satire level in I'm Sorry gets. This isn't exactly Chris Morris here, but it's an amusing and pointed joke nonetheless. The rest of I'm Sorry's humour tends to lie in the absurd, and that's what you get with the other enemies, all of whom are famous celebrities. All of these folks can be either punched or struck with a fan, depending on what level you're on, but naturally they will respawn before too long. The initial enemy you face, the guy with the sunglasses, may look like a more typical thug, but he is actually a very popular Japanese comedian named Tamori, and the glasses are a part of his act. If Tamori catches Gombi, then he'll strip him down to his tighty-whities and give him a jolly good whipping, which is quite the sight indeed whenever you first come across it. Certainly not what you would expect from the majority of arcade games unless you're actively playing the library of a company like Comad or whatever. This isn't Tamori's only appearance in a game, by the way. You can also find him in the rare All Night Nippon version of Super Mario Bros., which is based on a popular late-night variety show from Fuji TV and replaces the usual enemies with even more celebrities. Tamori was the host of the All Night Nippon programme, and he takes the place of the Piranha Plant. The second celebrity comes into play on the third level, and it's none other than Shohei Giant Baba, the legendary pro wrestler and founder of All Japan Pro Wrestling. Giant Baba takes a few more punches to take out than the rest of the enemies, and if he catches Gombi, he's going to majorly screw him up with repeated backbreakers. Now, although he does also hail from Niigata Prefecture, Baba does seem like a somewhat random inclusion after Tamori, who you may expect probably made a good few jokes about Tanaka over the years. But why would Baba be here aside from his status as a Japanese icon? I can't find too much when it comes to any meaty connections between the pair, but this is actually Baba's second appearance in a Sega arcade game. You can play as him in 1984's Apu, the pro wrestling game. So perhaps it's just as simple as that. When you start the second loop of the game's levels, the other enemies will gradually make their presence known. Michael Jackson, someone who's going to be pretty synonymous with Sega, isn't too much different from Tamori, but if he catches you then he'll go all thriller, turn into a vampire and suck your blood. Carl Lewis is the toughest enemy of the lot, to be honest. While he only falls to a single hit, his jumping makes him a hell of a lot harder to punch than the others, and his move is to kick your ass into complete and total submission. Finally, we have Madonna. She's not too tough, but she does occasionally stop to aim a kiss in your direction, and her special is to sit on you while blowing kisses, which doesn't necessarily sound like a bad way to go. I don't think that Michael Jackson, Carl Lewis or Madonna have any real connection to our scandal-racked friend here. My assumption is that they collectively simply represent the good old US of A, who were blamed by some of Tanaka's ardent supporters for his downfall due to Lockheed revealing the scandal. And yes, I probably should mention that the game is a bit fast and loose when it comes to skin colour. Carl Lewis is a lot lighter than he should be, and Giant Baba is a lot darker than he should be. In fact, Michael Jackson is also a lot lighter than he should be. This game actually came out before Jacko's vitiligo diagnosis. I could have called this vid the spooky game that predicted Michael's skin condition, but nah. I'm going to guess this is down to not having the likenesses be too accurate. Legal reasons. As you loop through the game's 4 levels, you'll come across even more ways to screw up big time. There's statues of Gombi himself that will be activated if you pass them and they'll come for you, little islands that shrink and disappear, giving you a very unwanted bath, water hydrants that spew out fire, as well as the addition of multiple barrels to avoid and conveyor belts to thwart your movement. There's a lot going on, and it's quite cool that there are so many ways to fail. It's even cooler that they almost all come with their own animation. All the absurd humour and satire aside, I'm Sorry is actually a very fun and playable game. It's not necessarily the best made Pac-Man-esque title, but it's one of my favourites, thanks to all of the character it has, the stupidly catchy music, the odd landmark that you'll find dotted around. There's quite a lot to love about it, and I can recommend playing it even beyond the context and the humour. One thing that is quite ridiculous about it, mind you, is that somehow the game managed to get a Western release, which I do find rather amusing. I mean, this is such a ridiculously Japanese game, a big reference to a major political scandal, and 99% of the Western folk who played it likely weren't going to get most of the details unless they were reading the broadsheets or what have you. Now sure, it may well be funny regardless, and it's not a bad thing that it got a Western release, But if there's any arcade game that you would expect to have not gotten a release outside of Japan, outside of the endless Mahjong games and the like, well, it would be this one. And yet, it did, with virtually zero changes being made. Now, unsurprisingly, it wasn't a successful title in the West, although it did perform well in Japan, being listed by the trade paper Game Machine as the top-selling table arcade of the month in May of 1985. Happily, we do actually know the person who planned it, a man named Kenichi Kumakura, who joined Corland straight out of art school and made I'm Sorry as his first game. Going by a little interview with him from Famitsu in 1991, that's translated by Shmuplations, he was pretty happy with the end result. Now, before we leave this whole subject behind, a couple of other little things should be noted. I'm Sorry is actually not the only game that features this corrupt fan-waving leader. There are actually two others in which he appears. The first is another Sega-published arcade game from Corland. This time it's 1985's Seishun Scandal, or Youth Scandal, which ended up getting a Western release as My Hero. Now, this isn't exactly the best of titles, a painfully hard beat-em-up where you play as some young idiot who's got the punch range of a friggin' acorn, and you've got to save the kidnapped girl, as normal. Tanaka appears at the end of the game's first stage to celebrate your success, before the boss fight. However, he only appears if you manage to rescue your friend, and then successfully took him with you to the stage's end. Playing My Hero is hard enough as it is, and performing this task is damn near impossible, but happily a channel named EduSword on YouTube has footage of it being done. Hearty congratulations are in order for that, methinks. And then on the Famicom, we have Mahjong Club Nagatachu Sosaisen from 1991. Now this, shockingly, is a weird one. The goal of this game, other than playing Mahjong, is to beat fellow lawmakers from the Liberal Democratic Party, including Tanaka, in order to become the leader. And yes, Tanaka himself is right there on the game's title screen, complete with his fan. Certainly a novel idea for a Mahjong game. One usually imagines that this sort of thing would be very niche indeed, but who can really say? Perhaps people had an appetite to play Mahjong against real-life political figures, or at least against people who look a hell of a lot like them. You may well have gone into this video not knowing about the video game history of Kakuei Tanaka. Hell, you may not have known anything about him at all. But now, you've been informed, and you can see quite clearly that in the world of games, this former Prime Minister is clearly a major figure who should be celebrated until the very end of days. Okay, perhaps not. I'm Sorry is a right fun little game though, and you should at least play that one. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little video. If you didn't, I'm certainly not apologising for it. Bye for now.